There's a strange ache in knowing what to do and still not doing it. It's the quiet paralysis that comes not from ignorance, but from clarity. You already see the path. You can name every step. You even imagine the peace that follows. Yet your body resists like a door that won't open. Carl Jung once wrote, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And this is where most people stop, not because they don't understand, but because they do. And that understanding frightens them, because doing what you know you must means confronting the reason you haven't already. You know what to do. Leave, start, end, speak, change. But every time you try, something invisible pulls you back. That something is not laziness. It's protection. It's the nervous system remembering what happened the last time you moved toward something real. The mind can want healing, but the body remembers the cost of it. And until both agree, you stay frozen, half reaching, half retreating. If this feels familiar, stay with me. Jung believed our consciousness is not ruled by reason, but by what he called the unconscious will, the hidden network of fears, memories, and identifications that secretly decide for us. You think you're making a choice, but often the choice is being made through you, by everything you have not yet faced. The hand that won't move, the message left unsent, the plan delayed again. These are not failures of discipline. They are symptoms of an unseen conflict. Part of you knows what to do. Part of you fears what that action will unearth. And those two parts live inside the same body, tugging the same strings. We often think resistance means we're weak. But resistance is intelligence in disguise. It's the psyche's way of saying, something in this action feels unsafe. Maybe once, doing the right thing led to rejection. Maybe once, telling the truth broke something you needed to survive. So now, every time the truth stirs again, your body flinches like it's still living that moment. That's why you procrastinate on your own becoming. It's not about the task. It's about the memory that task awakens. You learned avoidance as a language of safety. The unfinished projects, the unspoken words, the silent longing. They all trace back to moments where acting led to pain. So the body learned to pause. But now, that old defense is trying to protect you from a danger that no longer exists. You're not refusing to act. You're refusing to relive. And until that distinction becomes conscious, you'll mistake trauma for indecision. Jung said the thing we most need is often found in the place we least want to look. That's why knowing isn't enough, because knowing shines a light on the path, but the shadow beside it still holds power. You can't walk forward until you've turned toward that shadow and said, "I see why you're scared." Only then does the will become whole again. You might notice this pattern in others too. The friend who talks endlessly about change but never takes the first step. The artist who spends years preparing to create. The person who always says they need more clarity before they act. They're not waiting for clarity. They're avoiding confrontation with their own fear. Because once they act, they'll lose the excuse of not knowing. And when the excuse is gone, they must face the truth. The life they want will cost the identity they've built to survive. That's the secret grief behind most hesitation. Every change means a small death. To become who you are, something in you must stop being who you were. And even when the old self hurts, it's still familiar. So we cling to pain out of loyalty because it's the only home we've known. You can see it in the way people stay where they suffer. Relationships, jobs, habits. Not because they don't see the exit, but because the exit demands they leave themselves behind. The deeper truth Jung revealed is this: you can't move forward through willpower alone. Willpower fights the symptom. Integration heals the cause. You can't bully your unconscious into obedience. You must befriend it. You must make a space wide enough for both the fear and the desire to exist without shame. Then, slowly, the fear begins to relax its grip. Because it realizes you're not trying to erase it. You're listening. And in that listening, something ancient inside you starts to trust movement again. That's why true change feels less like force and more like permission. Permission to want what you want. Permission to act without needing proof that you'll be safe. Permission to stop waiting for fear to vanish before you begin. Because fear is not the enemy. It's the echo of your own depth calling you home. Every time you hesitate, ask, what part of me still believes this action is unsafe? Don't answer with logic. Answer with compassion. Because that hesitation is often the voice of a younger self still living inside you, protecting you the only way it knows how. It says, if I stop controlling, we'll get hurt again. It says, if I fail, they'll leave. And until you speak back with gentleness, it will keep running your life from the shadows. That's the paradox Jung pointed to. We resist healing because healing threatens the system that once kept us alive. And until we honor that, we'll keep mistaking resistance for failure instead of gratitude. The moment you stop fighting your avoidance and start understanding it, something softens. You realize it was never your enemy. It was your nervous system trying to protect a heart that still trembles at the thought of being seen. And that's where real movement begins. Not in the doing, but in the seeing. You don't need to push harder. You need to see clearer. Because when the fear is seen, it loses its shape. And what's left is something startlingly simple. The natural impulse toward life that was buried under years of self-defense. That impulse has always known what to do. It was just waiting for you to feel safe enough to let it lead. So maybe the question isn't, why can't I do what I know I should? Maybe it's, what part of me still believes it's dangerous to be free? When you sit with that, when you let that question hum quietly beneath your skin, you begin to sense the quiet war inside you. Not between right and wrong, but between safety and aliveness. And somewhere deep in that war, a truce begins to form, fragile and luminous. And it feels like the beginning of remembering something you forgot you once knew. We call it resistance, but often it's reverence. Reverence for the past selves who carried you through storms you didn't have words for. They built the habits that now hold you back. But back then, they held you together. Jung said, every complex has a core of meaning. Every defense hides devotion. So before you tear down your walls, thank them. They protected something sacred. And the moment you honor that protection, your walls soften from prison into threshold. This is the quiet alchemy of awareness. What was once a cage becomes a doorway. Because once you stop blaming yourself for not moving faster, you start hearing the message your paralysis was trying to send. Every stuck place says, I need gentler conditions to bloom. And that's not weakness. It's wisdom. Growth is not about forcing motion. It's about creating enough safety for the truth to unfold. You can see this everywhere, in the way nature grows. A seed doesn't break its shell until the conditions are right. The breaking isn't forced. It's inevitable. But we forget that human souls bloom the same way. We don't evolve by pushing. We evolve by ripening. And ripening takes patience, tenderness, and the courage to stay present with discomfort. People often misread this as procrastination. But the psyche is never idle. It's always negotiating between who you've been and who you're becoming. So when you feel yourself stuck, you're actually standing in that negotiation. Part of you clings to the familiar wound. Part of you reaches toward the unknown wholeness. And the silence between those parts is what you call stuck. When Jung spoke of individuation, he meant this exact process, the slow reconciliation between your conscious will and your unconscious truth. Not the elimination of fear, but its integration. Because the self you're becoming cannot emerge by rejecting what came before. It must include it. That's why the next version of you feels delayed. You're still gathering all the lost pieces that need to come along. Nothing real can move forward until everything inside you has been given a place. This is why people repeat the same lessons in different disguises. They keep meeting the same kind of relationship, the same kind of job, the same kind of silence. Not because they haven't learned, but because the learning hasn't yet reached the part of them that's still afraid. The universe repeats what the heart refuses to listen to. It's not punishment, it's persistence. Life will keep showing you what you avoid until avoidance is no longer your language of safety. You might notice, too, that clarity often arrives right before collapse. Because when your conscious mind finally understands what's needed, the unconscious begins to panic. It feels the threat of change and floods you with resistance, distraction, fatigue. This is not regression. It's the body's final attempt to stay familiar. So if everything feels heavier right when you decide to move, that's not failure. That's transformation announcing itself. Jung wrote that the way is not upward or forward, but downward into the depths. And that's the hardest part of doing what you know you must, realizing the next step might look like descent. You don't rise by escape. You rise by entering the very feeling you've been avoiding. Because underneath every resistance is grief. The grief of who you could not be when you had to survive. And until that grief is felt, you'll keep mistaking numbness for control. So when you know exactly what to do, but can't, pause. Don't ask, how do I fix this? Ask, what pain am I protecting? Because the answer to that question will unlock more motion than any self-discipline ever could. The psyche doesn't heal through force. It heals through understanding. And understanding turns fear into guidance. You can recognize this shift the moment it happens. What once felt like effort starts feeling like alignment. You stop trying to change and start naturally outgrowing what no longer fits. Because the energy that was trapped in repression now becomes available for creation. That's why people who integrate their shadows suddenly seem alive in a new way. Their energy is no longer spent on hiding. They've stopped resisting their own power. But integration isn't a single revelation. It's a lifelong dialogue. Each new truth you meet will stir an old defense. And each defense you meet is another invitation to love yourself deeper. So don't rush this work. It's not linear. Healing spirals. You'll revisit the same lessons, but each time from a higher vantage. What once overwhelmed you becomes something you can now hold with tenderness. That's how you know you're growing. Not by perfection, but by compassion. When your first response to your own hesitation is curiosity instead of shame, you've begun the real work Jung spoke of. Because consciousness expands not through will, but through warmth. Awareness is the light. Love is the heat that makes transformation possible. And as you start seeing your patterns through that light, you realize something profound. You were never lost. You were incubating. Every delay, every pause, every failure was a form of waiting until your inner conditions could sustain your next level of truth. You weren't avoiding the path. You were ripening for it. And that changes everything. Because now, when you feel resistance, you no longer shame it. You dialogue with it. You listen. You learn what it's protecting. And then, gently, you invite it to move with you instead of against you. That's the invisible art of real transformation. Not conquering the self, but uniting it. And as that unity deepens, a new kind of stillness begins to form inside you. One that's not about paralysis, but peace. It's the stillness before flight, the stillness that says, I am finally safe enough to move. And when that moment comes, action no longer feels like a leap. It feels like remembering how to walk. But even then, the mind still whispers its old refrains. What if it's too late? What if I fail again? And you smile, because you've heard those voices before. They're just echoes of the part of you that still believes safety and aliveness are opposites. Now you know better. Now you know the only real safety is in becoming fully yourself. And so, you begin, not because fear is gone, but because love for what's possible has grown louder. And love, when it grows loud enough, becomes movement. Softly, almost imperceptibly, life begins to rearrange itself around your willingness to act. And something ancient in you exhales, as if a long-forgotten promise has finally been kept. But even in that moment of motion, another truth lingers quietly. You will resist again. You will forget again. And that's okay, because the cycle itself is the teaching. Every time you hesitate, you return to the threshold of your own becoming. Each pause is another chance to meet yourself with more honesty, more patience, more presence. The work was never about eliminating resistance. It was about transforming your relationship to it. Jung called this the reconciliation of opposites, the moment when the conscious and the unconscious stop fighting and start cooperating. You no longer see your fear as failure. You see it as feedback. You realize that hesitation simply means a part of you needs more care before it can move. And when you give it that care, the movement that follows is effortless. This is how the psyche grows, not through conquest, but through communion. The will that once felt divided becomes whole. And from that wholeness, decisions arise naturally. You stop asking, how do I make myself do this? And start wondering, what inside me still needs to feel safe enough to allow this? That single shift changes everything. Because now, every act of courage is no longer a fight. It's a reunion. You act not to prove strength, but to express coherence. You no longer chase outcomes, you embody alignment. And alignment doesn't demand, it invites. It whispers, when you are ready, we'll move. That's why the most powerful people often look calm. They're not without fear. They've befriended it. They've learned that clarity without compassion becomes cruelty, even toward oneself. So they move gently, not because they're uncertain, but because they're listening. And that listening makes their motion precise. Jung understood that individuation, the becoming of who you truly are, is not an achievement, but a rhythm. A continuous dance between knowing and not knowing, doing and being still. You'll never be finished with this dance, because the self is infinite in layers. Every time you integrate one shadow, another appears, smaller, subtler, but still longing to be seen. That's not regression. That's depth. So if today you still find yourself saying, I know what to do, I just can't do it, breathe. You're not broken. You're just standing at another layer of the same threshold. And thresholds are meant to be honored, not rushed. Because what you're carrying across this time is heavier than before. More truth, more awareness, more soul. Look closely at your resistance. It always hides something sacred. Maybe it's love you haven't admitted. Maybe it's grief you haven't touched. Maybe it's the quiet realization that stepping forward means finally forgiving yourself. Whatever it is, it's asking to be included, not conquered. Because the moment it's included, your knowing and your doing become one. And that unity, fragile, luminous, endlessly unfolding, is what Jung meant when he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Every act of awareness rewrites a piece of that fate, not by changing your past, but by transforming your relationship to it. So tonight, as you sit with the weight of what you know you must do, don't rush to act. Just listen to the tremor beneath the knowing, the ache beneath the delay. That's where the door is. And when you're ready, not when you're perfect, you'll find your hand reaching for the handle almost without thought. Because knowing was never the issue. Permission was. And when that permission finally blooms inside you, quiet and steady, you'll take the step you've been circling for years. Not as an act of courage, but as the most natural expression of being alive. And maybe then you'll realize you always knew what to do. You were simply waiting to love yourself enough to do it. And somewhere deep in that realization, a softer question begins to form. One that doesn't demand an answer, only your continued listening. What if the part of you that still hesitates is simply the part that wants to be held while you finally move?